Hey everybody, welcome to Digging Underground, where we dig Lucha Underground, which is still not back and probably won't be for a little bit. But I don't know about you, man. I greatly miss it.
Yeah, definitely. It was like a void in wrestling is gone just because it filled such a unique product that it was just so different that it's like you kind of miss that. You kind of miss the stories, the characters, the excitement every week of what they put together. It's like it's just one of those things where we hope it comes back really soon because we do miss it.
But I'm your host as always, Chad. It's my co-host Joe. How you doing tonight, Joe?
Oh, it's been a crazy week. I That's more something I did on our other podcast, but it's been a pretty crazy week. But I'm looking forward to the show tonight. How about you?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the show. We have a pretty unique topic tonight, kind of a timely one too. We actually announced this last week, which is going to be a kind of going over like the history of women in wrestling. And it's funny, like we didn't even really know in advance that this was going to be as timely as it was because so much has happened in this past week between Greg Valentine's comments and the match on the NXT special, which some are saying is like the best women's match in WWE history, and then you have that fiasco on Raw. It's been a very eventful week for good and bad for women in wrestling.
Yeah, definitely. It's been one of those weeks where you could kind of go a lot of ways with that. And like you mentioned, all the situations and all bringing something different to the table. It's just one of those things where it kind of just shows like the divide in terms of like kind of how women are, kind of how people perceive them, and how people like what the reaction is because of various aspects of it. It's just like such an
Greg
interesting topic.
Valentine's a moron. Let's be honest here. You
No,
know,
but
it's
I
like
wasn't even talking about him. I just mean like obviously he's a part of it where it's kind of like to have that like I'm sure it's like a mindset a lot of like guys have from. I mean, I'm not generalizing. It's just like it's just kind of what they were at the time, where like they kind of look at women in that way, and it's like I'm not justifying the guy. I think it's stupid. I don't think you should ever say that. And I think it's wrong, especially when you look at the way mainstream media is today. But it's like it's kind of like when you kind of like wander down and you see like some older people kind of just being racist. It's like you don't you don't appreciate that. You don't just I'm not saying Hulk Hogan, by the way. I'm just saying like anyone in the South or something like that. If you go down there and you see like some people like that. It's just like it's just what they were raised on. It's like you don't like that,
yeah.
and it's like it's like it's dumb, but it's like you kind of realize that that's just the notion they were grew up with, and they refuse to change that, and it's sad.
Here's the thing, like I don't have an issue with anyone that doesn't really enjoy women's wrestling because there are a lot of people that are respectful about it.
Yeah,
They just it's not really their thing, and I can get that because for a while it wasn't really my thing because of the way that it was being presented. And over the years I've become a big fan of it. And we're going to kind of get into that more as it goes on. So I really don't have any issue with anyone that doesn't care for it, but when you're saying stuff like, "Oh, those women need to get back in the kitchen." Come on. Yeah, maybe some people were raised that way, but it's like that's
yeah.
just stupid.
Like I said, especially in this day and age where there's like so much going on, that's like you know, I mean, I again to not kind of making light of this whole situation. I like read this like just funny person saying like, well, Ronda Rousey probably makes more in one fight than Greg Valentine made his whole career. So it's like
Probably does.
probably
Well, I
does.
don't know.
I considering she like main events a lot of those things, probably has like a lot of endorsements and stuff. She probably does make a lot of money off of that stuff. So
It's a tough call though, because Greg Valentine was around during that Hogan era, and everybody made huge
that's
money
true.
back then. Who knows?
Yeah,
But
but
let's jump into our topic here for the night: women in wrestling. And we're going to kind of start with the old days here, although neither of us were really around in the 50s, obviously, so we don't have too much here to go by other than just kind of what we've heard. You have like a lot of names back then from like Mildred Burke and Moolah, and it was kind of taken seriously. Like everyone knew that these were like tough women, but it was still kind of like a side attraction. It was almost like the little people wrestling. It was like come see the lady wrestlers. You know, it was like kind of a weird thing where it's like you kind of took them seriously in a way because you knew that they were tough, but it was like the guys were still very much the main attraction back then.
yeah, very much so. It's kind of like one of those things where you kind of had like a circle of women too. Like it wasn't like a ton of like there were variety, but it was kind of like they were all kind of in the same circle. So you kind of had like it was like all through Moolah and through I don't remember the guy's name off the top of my head. I think it's like Billy Wolf. I might be wrong there, but I know he was kind of a part of that. It was kind of like they had like their they had like their camp of women they would send to various shows, and it's just like it was kind of weird because you just have like that you don't have anything like that today where you have like this independent like women's agency where you just like get these women's wrestlers on your shows and they would just like be run through this person who like makes profit off of that. It's just like you don't get that today. Today it's just like everyone's their own contractor, so it's kind of a
It was
different.
almost like a circus kind of thing
Yeah,
back then.
exactly. It was kind of like I'll lend you my talent if you want to use them on your shows, but you pay me a cut and they get a cut, and it's like, you don't really get that today. It's like one of those old school things that you associate with that time period. But right now, it's just like I couldn't even imagine. I could imagine like some, like I don't know, Trish Stratus like representing all these women and being like, hey Vince, you want to use them on my show? You pay me a cut. You just wouldn't get that today. But it was like back in the day, that was kind of the deal.
And from like a fan perspective, it's kind of interesting to me because I've actually like asked my grandfather about it because he used to watch wrestling back in the day, and I was like, what were your kind of thoughts on women's wrestling? And it was kind of funny because it didn't really seem like it was like a TNA kind of thing back then. Like it didn't really seem like the guys were just like perving on the women or anything because I mean they were like these strong women, but it was like I don't know, it's weird. It's like they kind of just got off on it, just seeing these women fight or something.
I I actually really have never like delved into asking like my grandparents about that, but like, I've heard my grandmother say stuff like, "Oh, like Moolah and May, they were great in their day," but I don't really know how much she watched them like in the day. Like they used to go to some of those like local California shows. I don't know if they were on any of those or any of that, but it's like at the time it's kind of like one of those things where I do think back at the time it was kind of just such a novelty thing that you wouldn't really associate, and I think it's one of those things where it's like back then it was kind of more of a like you said it was more kind of like the sideshow thing, but at the same time it was kind of like you didn't have women like all over the show, so it's kind of like you when you got that one women's match, you'd be like, oh look, there's something different. Whereas today it's a little bit different with that. You kind of get like a woman in a variety of roles, and it's better in ways I think, but it's also like I think back then it just kind of stood out more as a focus. I think that's kind of why it was a sideshow aspect, where it was like it wasn't as incorporated in wrestling. It was kind of just like, oh, well, come see this happen, but it's like you didn't get that all over the show like today, where it's like women everywhere.
Yeah, it's like it wasn't quite like the late '90s were, where it's like you see them in their like bra and panties and stuff. We'll get to that era, but it's kind of like
For
it was like
the time it was
yeah, it
racist.
was like a pinup kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like they had all these pinup models and stuff, and I really don't want to speak badly about the dead, but I've heard some really bad things about Mola. Like she was like really hard on a lot of these women, and just I don't know if you've really heard these things, but I've heard some pretty not so nice things about the way that she treated a lot of these women.
Yeah, there's a lot of urban legends out there about her and that Billy Wolf guy I talked about. It's like I don't know for sure. I don't really know what's right or what's wrong, but it's one of those things where I think it's just one of those things where I think everyone's heard about that. It's like, hopefully, you hope it's not true, but if it is, you just kind of feel bad for the women what they had to go through because again, these were kind of women they kind of brought in and at a young age and kind of like trained. And it's like, when at the time, like I said, it was like that was the only agency. So if that fell through and you kind of had a bad side, you were pretty much done with wrestling because you wouldn't really find work anywhere else. That's kind of where they went through. And it's like, if you devoted a lot of your life to wrestling, you couldn't really wrestle, you're kind of screwed in terms of like financially, in terms of a lot of things. And it's like, that's one of the worst parts about something like that is like if you have a falling out like that, someone couldn't get work somewhere else, they would be stuck. Whereas like today,
Yeah.
two people are falling out of promotion and they could go to another promotion or they could find some, they have various other outlets. Whereas back then it was a lot different.
All right, let's jump into the '80s here when things kind of started to get more mainstream. I would say that women's wrestling kind of got more of a focus in the '80s, although it was still kind of like a side attraction. But you did have like Wendy Richter, and she was actually like pretty over, and she got some mainstream attention because of like doing the stuff with Cyndi Lauper. And Cyndi Lauper, I think herself is a name that we should really mention here because she really brought a lot of media attention to the WWE in the '80s. I think people have said this. I think she's just as responsible for like the '80s boom as like Hulk Hogan was because she brought so much outside attention to the product.
Yeah, definitely. It was one of the few times, like, they always say kind of like mainstream celebrities around, but it was one of the few times where you had like a really mainstream celebrity who was like, relevant to the culture. Like, not even so much just one generation. It was like people just knew who Cyndi Lauper was, and it was just kind of like ingrained in that mindset, and just branding it like rock and wrestling connection. It was like, the time was just so unique, so genius to do, and kind of like you said, kind of really helped bring mainstream attention to wrestling, and kind of just brought this different flavor to it. And it's weird because it's like something like that was so at the time you look at it, it's like it'd be the equivalent if you brought like a Taylor Swift or there's not really like a really like popular like a more rockish singer, but I'm just like trying to picture someone like that where it's you just bring someone in there like that and you get like
I
all
think
this
Taylor Swift's probably a good example because like Cyndi
yeah.
Lauper was pretty like a really big star in the '80s.
Yeah, and you think about that and you're just like at the time you think about the equivalent of that today and it's like I could maybe see Taylor Swift like appearing at like a wrestling show like here or there, but it's like I could,
I gotta admit, that'd be funny, like Taylor Swift kicking off the
yeah.
women's revolution.
But it's just to me like I think about it, it's like I would never picture doing like an angle or like a major role. You know what I mean? It's just like it's just such a
Yeah.
different climate now, and
It'd be kind of like one of those things where she shows up at Raw and she's like,
yeah.
maybe she'll have a good time, maybe she'll kind of seem like she doesn't want to be there, and then it's like people will talk about it for the rest of the week, but then they'll just kind of forget about it, and it'll just be kind of like one of those things that you'll like mention a few years later, like, oh hey, remember that time Taylor Swift was on Raw?
Yeah, and it's just like I'm sure like they know who she is, and obviously, you know, they'd use her if they wanted to. But it's one other thing where it's like they have this thing where they kind of you know they don't use all outdated celebrities, but they kind of use celebrities to get buzz, and it's like you said, they don't really know how to use them to get buzz these days. Whereas back then they did like that angle, and they just knew how to do that. And it's like it was just
Well, they did a
such a
pretty
different
good job
climate.
with the Arrow angle, I think.
Oh yeah, but he was like an actual fan, so that's kind of like you know
Yeah.
I was like he wanted to do that, so you know that's a rare situation. I wouldn't say it's rare. I'm sure a lot of like Hollywood actors are a fan, but you know at the same time it's like maybe they're older, they're not in shape. Whereas he was in shape. He is a fan. He obviously he has to work out for his show and he has to like keep in good shape. So it just was like one of those things where it was just a natural fit.
You also had the Jumping Bomb Angels, who were like really awesome, and I've actually went back and watched a lot of their stuff, and they were just really awesome, and it was kind of weird to see because you don't really hear about it too much when you're like looking back on history and stuff. But they were like really over, and it seemed like a bigger thing than it actually was, I guess.
Yeah, I remember they had it was like WWE Classics. They had like a match with them, and I forget who else. They had a match with them and someone else. And it was just I remember it being like a really really good tag match. I was just like surprised by that, like you were like wow, this is like something I could hold up today. And it's just like you just wouldn't expect that women's wrestling. What kind of you know what you remember more about it, like in our era when we grew up, what they were was kind of like you know a little bit different than that, where it's like you know this was just something that was like amazing for its time, and even today it holds up. So it's like you know
And they
just
were really over too. Like if you look at the crowd reaction, like the crowd really got into them, and it's just kind of funny because like you kind of hear about it like on the internet, but it's like I never heard about the Jumping Bomb Angels growing up. Like it wasn't really like this thing that I really heard a lot about, and it just kind of seems like they could have done more with them.
yeah, even like today, you don't like, you know, people always talk about like the icons of the '80s and you know, like you know, the bigger names and stuff. But you never really hear their names. It's like you're kind of just, you know, it's like they were over for their time, but they kind of just got forgotten about in a sense. And it is kind of sad because they're so talented. It's just like one of those things where you just kind of look at that and you're like, wow, like that's just so weird that you see something so over at the time. And it's like nowadays it's kind of like not even really referenced outside of like you said, like online and people who appreciate that at the time.
All right, we got to talk about Glow. We can't do a women's podcast without talking about Glow. But I'm kind of limited here because I've never actually seen it. I've just kind of heard a little bit about it. I've never actually seen it, so I can't really speak on how it was. But I know it was kind of like a campy-like thing. It was almost like a Wrestlelicious-like thing. Maybe probably taken a little more seriously than Wrestlelicious. But have you ever seen Glow or like heard that much about it? Or
I feel like I've probably seen clips of it, but I don't think I've like really ever like watched it. But I
I'd
know
like to watch it.
yeah, I know they've had some like they had like those like you said campy kind of unique characters. That's kind of like a trend in women's wrestling too, where you just have like these promotions that do like these all women's groups that are like campy and kind of like over the top. Because I know you had I mean, well, I don't really know how in depth we'll talk about because I don't think either of us seen like a lot of like WoW. You know what I mean? You remember WoW? That was like in the
Yeah,
'90s. It's
I
like
remember. Wow, I didn't see it,
yeah,
but
it's like those promotions are kind of. I think I actually ordered that pay. Did I order that pay per view? I don't think I ordered that pay-per-view, but I think I remember like seeing like a match or something out of it like later on down the line.
I
But
know they had like funny characters like a female cop or something like
yeah, they had
that,
like
that kind of
jail like
stuff.
girls that were in jail. I think they were called like Cage Heat or something like that, and like the Baywatch Squad. They had some unique characters, but so did Glow, and it's like one of those things where you know you know what I think about with Glow, and it's kind of a random story, but you know we were going to our Shimmer trip in Chicago, which I'm sure we'll get to later with that promotion, but
Oh yeah.
yeah, you know, it's like I remember just going through the line of security, and they're kind of like, you know, like the lady there was kind of asking me, she was kind of a little bit of an older lady, but not that old, but she was like asking me like, oh, you
Was
know,
that
like,
the airport?
yeah, yeah, at the airport, which you know, you go through security and they're like checking your ID and stuff, and you know, she asked me like, oh, so what are you going to Chicago for? And I'm like, oh, I'm just going to go see a wrestling show, and I think there was more to it than that. I'm kind of like blanking on my mind, but I just remember like she was like, oh, a wrestling show, like you know, I kind of like she was like asking me like what it was and was it WWE and stuff like that. I'm like, no, it's just kind of an all women show. She's like, oh, you're gonna go see Glow, and I'm like, no, it's not
Glow.
Glow, but you know, it's just so random to me to hear that like you know in the airport, like just a couple of years ago where it's like that was obviously such a long time ago that someone like actually remembers it like that. And that it's kind of like one of the promotions that when you think of women's wrestling, people bring up like people from that time period will bring up because that's what they remember, that over the top promotion. And I haven't seen a whole lot of it, like you said you haven't, but it's just one of the things you're curious about because you've heard so much about it, and you kind of realize it probably wouldn't be like the best women's wrestling, but you kind of just would appreciate for what it was, a lot of characters and kind of a defining role for women, having like more characters like that, and kind of like over the top personalities. I mean, you had that kind of like with some women in the time, but it's like a whole promotion that was so unique.
I shouldn't be, but there is no way if someone was asking me in an airport that I would admit that I'm going to an all-women's wrestling show because I would just feel like people would be judging me and thinking of me as this like huge pervert.
Yeah, but she to prove you wrong, she said glow, so she knew her
That's
stuff.
true.
She was like, she didn't automatically go to what like my family did. I was like, oh, you're gonna go see these women wrestling Jello or something like that, which is a very outside minded set. But that's kind of one of those things where it's like people have that preconceived notion. And it's like, you
It
should.
reminds me of another one of those like little promotions there that they had on pay-per-view. It was like the Carmen Electra's mud wrestling or something like that.
No, no, that was naked women's wrestling, which was
Oh, okay.
there was another one too called like a
I didn't
W.
watch that for the record.
I didn't either, but there's another one called like WEW, which was around for like years, which was kind of like
I think they're still around.
it might still be actually. I'm not really sure, but they were kind of like they were like an all women's promotion, but they were kind of more the risque route too, where I don't think they went fully like that, where it was like just completely like that, but it was kind of like they had those
I
kind of
think
matches
Velvet
and
Sky
stuff.
used to work there.
I think she did. Like a few of the more like kind of well known like independent wrestlers worked there, but I just remember they had some weird characters there. Like they had like a like GI Bro, but you like the Godfather's Ho, yeah, like GI Ho, and it was like I just remember
Oh
like
my
hearing about
gosh.
characters like that, and it's just like now it's kind of campy and stupid, but at the time it's just like wow, like this is quite the promotion here, but that we'll get more to that later on. But it's one of those things where I think this kind of set the trend for kind of like these out there characters for women that were kind of different from the norm. Because usually when you think of women from like that time period, you think of like the serious women's wrestler, or you think of like the valet, like Elizabeth, who is a classy valet, or kind of like the like this like Sherry, who's over the top, kind of like crazy valet. But that's not like some different characters. I think that was kind of like the trend at the time where people found it different.
We should actually talk about Elizabeth before we move on to the 80s. She was a very popular figure. She was the Macho Man's valet. She was actually his real life wife. And they did a lot of interesting like storyline stuff back then. Like they did the wedding angle, and they did the angle where they were like separated for a while, and he was with Sherry, and he was like the Macho King, and then they got back together, and it's like people ate this stuff up. And it was actually like really popular with like the women's audience because like a lot of the women were looking at this as like a soap opera like thing, and they were into it. And like the guys, like they liked Elizabeth because they thought she was like really attractive, and it was just kind of a win all around.
And even beyond that, she had like this classy glow about her, which you didn't really get with. I mean, there are women who kind of claim to be classy, but you just never really got that vibe with her. Like, all the women were kind of like the hot model types. And not that Elizabeth wasn't attractive, but it was kind of like she was
Well, she
more
had like
the
a movie star kind
exactly.
of
She was kind of more
quality.
just the elegant type, kind of like respectful type. And that was different for its time. And I think that was a lot of the charm there. Was kind of like you had this elegant type of woman who, obviously with the women audience could easily stand out because she's obviously she's not like the other women. She's like elegant, she's classy, and kind of what women aspire to be like, and it's kind of why they got why they were able to relate to her and get into her. And like you said, they did like so many classic angles revolving around her, and she was like even at the forefront, one of the most popular used figures in those storylines. 'Cause I think of like the Mega Powers when they had like their explosion, and they had
Oh yeah.
Elizabeth in the middle of that. It's like that was like a woman in the main event angle of like heading into WrestleMania causing this. Since like today you think of that and you're like it might happen, but it's like it wouldn't be nearly as impactful. And it's just like it was
I
such
think
an
they just
amazing
screw it
time
up
period.
these days.
Yeah, but it's like such an amazing time period where it's like you just had a woman like that so over with the crowd and so beloved that it's just like amazing. It was just kind of one of those things where they presented a woman in the right way and it just worked.
I think like a modern day version of that would probably be like Cena, Zack Ryder, and Eve Torres.
Yeah, that
And I hate to even
oh
compare
man,
them, but that's just kind of just goes to show how they would do that today. And it's
yeah.
just they
Or
had more
even
patience back then, and they were better storytellers back then.
or even Rusev, Lana, and Dolph right now going on. It's like that's not really main event
That's a
angle.
little better, but
No, but
yeah.
I mean it's not really main event angle, but it's like you kind of have the classy woman, but they kind of twisted that all around. They kind of made it different. So
All right, let's move into the 90s here. The early 90s were actually kind of an interesting time to me with women because it's like there was this big push within WWE to actually, it actually seemed like they wanted to make the women's division bigger. And they brought in Alundra Blaze, who was Medusa in WCW. They brought in Bull Nakano, Aja Kong. And it's kind of funny to me because the division back then, I think, is like what a lot of people kind of would want the division to be today. But it's like, it was kind of ahead of its time. And it's like, it was like they were treating them like men and just kind of letting them go out and have good matches. But it was like that wasn't really what the audience at the time really wanted, if that makes sense. Which is unfortunate, but it's just like it just didn't work.
I feel like too. I used to hear stories that the guys weren't exactly happy that the girls were going out there and like
I can
outworking them. But yeah, that was kind of like a thing of that time period too. I remember if you go back, it's kind of mind blowing when you think about it now, just because of the time period. But when you go back, there's like I forgot what year exactly it is, but there's a Survivor Series match that actually has like a bunch of Joshi women in it, where they kind of had like this huge tag with Alundra Blaze and all these unique women's wrestlers that some of which still even wrestle today. But it's like, at the time you just think of that and you're like, wow, like the idea of WWE doing this, like maybe not so much now because obviously they kind of acknowledge that, but it's like a few years ago you'd be like mind blown, like this actually happened. Like I could never imagine this, but
They really did try hard to build this division.
and even I don't think we'll like talk too much about because it really didn't last that long. But even WCW tried that too. They brought in Bull Nakano. They
Oh yeah, we'll get into that.
Okay, I didn't know if we were gonna like get into that because that theirs lasted like not that long. But yeah, they definitely tried like a conceited effort to like make Alundra Blaze their top star. And in fairness, even though like it didn't obviously there were those issues where it was like kind of weird to adjust to, they were seemed dead set on it until she left. So it's like, to their credit, they never gave up on it. They kept trying and trying, and some of those matches were amazing too. I remember you and I forgot what it was. I think it was like one of those Best of Raw DVDs or something like that.
Yep.
But you and I watched
Medusa and Bull Nakano,
yeah,
I
you
think.
you and I watched one of those matches from a random Raw, and it was like that was like more action than we get like in a regular episode of Raw today, and it's just like it was just done so amazingly. It was just so different. Like it was just so mind blowing to us that this actually happened on WWE TV. It was like you just mind blown.
Why do you think it didn't work with the audience back then?
Um, I
Do you think
think
maybe they just maybe the characters weren't colorful enough, or
I don't think that's the case. I think they're actually pretty unique characters. Yeah, they had pretty unique looks. I shouldn't say pretty unique characters, but they had like Bull Nakano was like this monster with like the crazy hair. And but I think in a sense, kind of what hurt it is I think they kind of went too campy with it at times because you had like Bertha Faye come
Bertha
in.
Faye?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think too, like that's such a down point in wrestling that I don't think anything was connecting at that time. I mean, you kind of
Yeah.
that was kind of during a period of like where they're kind of struggling and kind of like going up against competition. I feel like in a sense it's kind of unfair to say that didn't really click because it's like they didn't have an audience to click to. There wasn't like a whole lot of audience there, and you could say
It's
that maybe they
true.
would draw in like a female audience, but it's like people just they were WCW was doing a whole bunch of stuff. I don't this was like post I mean pre NWO, but it's like they were kind of getting their momentum going, and it's like WWE was kind of like in this bad period where they kind of were losing their stars, and it's like it's kind of one of those things where people look at it kind of like as a failure, but it's like it was just in a generation or time period. I think I would love to see it like in a different time period. Like I don't know how it would work in the Attitude Era, like per se, but I'd love to see it then to see if it actually clicked with people and worked in a more successful time period.
That's fair enough. All right, yeah, you kind of mentioned WCW. We'll get into that here. Medusa ended up going to WCW, where she infamously threw the
Yep.
women's title in the garbage can, and that pretty much marked the end of the women's division in WWE for a couple of years. And WCW kind of tried to build one, and they brought in some of their own Japanese women for it, and it just never really felt like something that they were that behind. Because you and I, we've actually been watching Nitro since like the early days. We've watched like I think from like fall '95 up to like the last show we watched was like August '96, and I think maybe we've seen like 4 or 5 women's matches, if that, on there.
Yeah, it's funny because that even like surpasses what I remember of it. 'Cause I kind of actually forgot about it, but like once we saw it, I remember like they did like Bull Nakano and Medusa like in their own version of like Hog Wild. They did like the match with the motorcycles where they smashed the losers or the winner smashes the loser's motorcycle. But even beyond that, I always remember the match they did with Medusa and Akira Hokuto at one of the pay-per-views was for the women's title. And it was like the one time you ever saw the women's title. It was like this one time they used the title. Maybe they actually
Yeah.
had her appear with it like after that, but I don't remember that. I just remember like it was very short lived. But like you said, on the nitros we watched, they kind of like threw in some women's wrestling. I remember they did like this again. They had like some random Joshi woman in there too, where they kind of just threw them out there one weekend. It was like this really fun tag match, and they were using some indie names too, like Malaya Osaka was on there a couple times. I remember against
Yep.
Medusa. Akira Hokuto appeared against Medusa. It's like they it was kind of, I think for them, it was more kind of like, well, we got a Laundry Blaze, we had that big angle. Now, how do we use her? And it's like they kind of use her in that Colonel Rob feud with Sherry, but it's like beyond that, they kind of just put her in these random matches because obviously they probably wanted to live out her contract of being a wrestler. So they're like, well, we're bringing these women and put it out there. But it's like they never, like you said, they never really got behind it. The title only lasted for I don't even know how long, maybe like a month, maybe one appearance. But it was like it all that build to it. It was just like I don't
Well,
know. It's just like you would think with their talent pool, they'd be like the company that would get behind it, but they just didn't.
to be fair too, it's like we were watching we were watching like the early days of the cruiserweight division, and it kind of didn't really feel like they were getting that behind that either. They just kind of threw together random matches, and it wasn't like represented every week. And obviously later on, like it kind of became like a much bigger thing, and that didn't really happen with the women's division. But it just kind of felt like all the focus just went on Hogan and all those guys.
Yeah, that's true. What it was really was it felt like Nitro was kind of like, focus on those guys, those major stars, and make sure they're like the core. And everything else just like throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks,
Yeah.
basically, and just like, which isn't bad. Sometimes in wrestling you want to do that, but it's like then you kind of don't really focus on too much of one thing, and you kind of lose track of that.
Even the Medusa title thing, it's like we were watching that and we kind of had this feeling like that was it. Because it always felt like this big moment when you're looking back on history, but then you actually watch it and it's like they didn't really touch on it. It's like it was like a one, like 2 or 3 minute thing. She dropped the title in the garbage can. I think they maybe referenced it like one other time for the rest of the show, and then we didn't even see her for a while. It was like this big angle, but it was like they didn't really make it into a big angle. I think history kind of makes it look bigger than it actually was.
Yeah, pretty much. I think that's the case with a lot of that stuff where it's like, I think the impact is more than anything because, like you mentioned, it was the end of like women's wrestling WWE for a while, and I think with anything like that, it's more the impact of the angle more so than like what actually happened because I think more people just kind of remember that event like, oh man, that was kind of like the end of women's wrestling WWE, which it was for like a few years, but it's like, it's kind of more that, more the idea of it, more so than like the actual event because in the build because you ask people and they probably remember that part, but you ask them about the rest of the angle, they're probably like as confused as we are, like. I don't remember most of that.
Yeah. Meanwhile, in WWE, though, they still had a women's presence, but it just wasn't wrestling. They had more valets like Sable and Sunny. And I can't really knock them for that. It was what the audience at the time wanted. And those two, I mean, they got way more over just going out to the ring and just being attractive than I think anyone ever actually did wrestling. It's sad but true.
Yeah, definitely. It was just the thing in the '90s where and one of the things too that kind of helped it was they didn't have a whole lot of women on the roster. Where it's kind of like those two were like the main two. Maybe you had like a couple of other women coming here or there, like Marlena and stuff like that. But those two were like the main two. They focused on push the stars. Whereas like, you know, a lot of times it goes all over the place where you're kind of like trying to push all these different characters at once. So it's like when you focus on just like a couple of women, kind of like AJ Lee like a few years ago, where they kind of like had her as a focal point. Like even as annoying as that got, she was like getting those pops. It's like you're focusing in on one person to where it kind of like works.
Yeah.
But it's like nowadays they kind of like throw so much at the wall that so many characters and women at the wall that you don't really get one that sticks. Whereas I think at that time period, you kind of had Sable and Sunny kind of against each other. I remember they did like the dueling Raw magazine shoots where they kind of had like each on the cover and like pick your favorite on the cover and stuff like that. Where it's kind of like you just had like this choice between them, and then it's one of those things where I think at the time, like you said, it was like smart marketing what the people wanted. But I think in a sense, like it's one of those things where it was a novelty thing at the time, whereas like now I wouldn't say it wouldn't work. I think obviously it still would kind of work, but it's like it's more for its time period it is now.
I think that's actually a big part of why today isn't working is because we'll get into this later, like quite a bit, but like they just throw out like all the women, like they just brought up all the NXT women at the same time. They're like, this is a women's revolution. They haven't really put any effort into like the individual characters, whereas with Sable and Sunny, they did. Like you knew exactly who Sable and Sunny were, and it wasn't, they were big stars. It wasn't always for maybe the best reasons, but you knew exactly who Sable and Sunny were.
Yeah, exactly. I fully agree with that. I think, as we get into it more, like, we'll get into why, but I think NXT does, like, that's kind of why NXT did such a good job. Because even if they don't have the most definable characters, you kind of know who everyone is and what they're about. Whereas, like, kind of like that, whereas, like, the main roster, you don't really get that. But yeah, I think for the time period, I was just definitely very well focused on it. I think they kind of, did a good job of that. And obviously, Sunny was a pretty big fixture in the '90s. And I think Sable obviously was kind of the more, the
Sable
attitude.
is actually a huge
Yeah,
star.
the Attitude Era. I was gonna say that the Attitude Era. You kind of had her as the main girl there, where they like she was the main star of that.
You had like Stone Cold, The Rock, DX, and then like Sable. Like Sable was like more over than most of the guys were, and like you mentioned earlier, like a lot of the guys were kind of taking offense in the early '90s to the fact that they were being outdone match-wise. I think a lot of people were probably, I think a lot of the guys were probably taking offense to the fact that this Sable girl was like way over than they were. So
I remember one of my last actual birthday parties was like quite a few years ago, but I remember that like they threw like this Attitude Era theme thing because they found like these Attitude Era party supplies, and I remember like the
wow.
I remember like the plates had like the Undertaker, Stone Cold, and The Rock, and he had like Sable on there. I just remember that because you said that like that comparison. It's like it's so true. Like that they marketed her as such a big star of that era. She was on those things with those guys.
And that's actually pretty awesome. I mean, some people will look at that and they'll say it's like a sexist thing, and it probably was. I mean, you look at the way that they were like presented back then, but I mean, Sable was a big star. You know, I think the fans they really did like her. I mean, we'll kind of get into like how the fans were in general with women back then, especially with ECW, but she was a genuine star.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can't argue that. It's again, I think it's just one of the things of the time period. Whereas, like, now we kind of look back then, like some of us, I think, are like some fans are kind of like embarrassed by that, like the idea, like if you have like kids or something, you're kind of like, well, I don't know if I want them watching that, but at the time, that was just kind of what people, it was kind of the shock value at the time. It was kind of like the era of pushing the envelope and doing all these crazy things. It was kind of like it just worked for its era. Whereas today, you really couldn't get away with that. But the time it just kind of like created this star and it kind of created this mystique around her. And it's like people wanted to see that. They wanted that's what wrestling was at the time.
All right, let's get into ECW since I mentioned it. Honestly, I think out of every promotion, they were probably the worst when it came to using the women. I mean, the crowd ate it up, but like given some of the things that they were chanting at those women, and like the company was encouraging them to do this, like could you even imagine something like this today?
No, I could not. But yeah, I agree with you with that. I think ECW had this. It's like they it's like they knew their fan base and their fan base, like you said, ate it up. But all the stuff they did was pretty controversial. I mean, they kind of presented women in a not so glamorous way. I mean, they were kind of that was kind of their point, I think. Whereas kind of you had the more elegant and classy women there. You kind of had like these kind of over the top, yeah, these
Yeah.
I can't even describe them, but they're kind of just over the top women that were kind of pushing the envelope with that. And it's like in a sense, it kind of predated what Sable did, and it's like obviously it wasn't nearly as good, but it's like you could see why they were doing it. It was again at the time. It's just like you look back at that now, and again, you're pretty embarrassed by that. I mean, you had women getting like power drivered and speared through tables and stuff like that. It's like sure that happened to main rosters, but just like you just had so much going on with that. I mean, you just had so much put into that where it's like they were just presented in that way.
You really like presented an environment where you're just like kind of encouraged to hate on women, and it's kind of sad. And I know some people will say that the world is like too politically correct today, and I do largely agree with that. But I think in this case, like I much prefer where we're at today. You know, I don't want to see like those things happening. I don't want to see like hear like these chants like you're a crack hoe. You know, that's
Yeah,
just
and
not a fan of that.
I think in a sense ECW is more so about like presenting them like in that way, obviously, and kind of either being a jerk kind of girl, like the conceited kind of girl, or being kind of like the sleep around type of girl, or being kind of just maybe the more hardcore one that was kind of like the face one. Like I'm trying to think of an example, but it's kind of the hardcore girls who would be kind of more the face, and then you kind of had like some of the violence where you kind of just like they kind of built up to wanting to see the women get theirs, and it's kind of a messed up mindset today. But at the time, again, like you said, people just ate that up when that would happen to women. But you push the envelope so much, I think it eventually got to the point where it's kind of like, yeah, we've seen that already.
You know, I'm not always a huge fan of like the NXT weekly TV today, but I will say one thing that I kind of liked was that whole like Vaudevillains Alexa Bliss thing, where it's like she was constantly being a jerk to them, like character-wise, and slapping them and stuff. And like if this were the '90s, they probably would like put her through a table or something. And it's like here, it's like they didn't do anything. And I know some guys will look at that and they'll be like, "Oh, well, that makes them look weak." And it's like, no, they're being gentlemen. You don't hit a woman, you know? It's like that's the way it should be. So they brought in their own woman to fight with her, and I think that's the way that it should be presented.
Exactly. It's like one of those things where you really shouldn't be building that up, where it's like you shouldn't be building up a spot like that. I do think it can work if you do it right. Like, someone, like you have a face or something, like he accidentally hits the heel girl and she falls down. I think it'd be a,
Oh yeah, that's
no, no, I'm
fine.
just saying that I think it'd be like you could do it if done right, like the whole violence aspect. But I think when you just do it to do it, where it's like you encourage fans to like get into that. It's kind of setting a bad example. And obviously in our society today, where there's a lot of domestic violence issues and a lot of that going on, you really don't want to touch on that type of thing. You really don't want to go that route because it's being controversial for the sake of being controversial to the point where you're just kind of making yourself out to look bad.
Yeah, I don't really have a problem with like those angles like you
Oh
mentioned
yeah,
where
I
like
know,
there
I know.
it's an accident or something, or even like the way Lucha Underground does it. We'll get into them later where it's like, the intergender stuff. Like I know some people aren't a huge fan of that. I'm a fan of it when it's done right. But like for me, it's just like when you're like encouraging people like, if this woman's a bad person, you should beat her. It's like, no, that's a bad message to send to people.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like like you said, when we both said when it's done right, it works. But when you just do it to be controversial, it's like you're gonna get attention, but it's not always attention you really should want.
All right, WCW, moving back to them, they tried to do their own eye candy thing with the Nitro Girls, which I actually think was a great idea, and it was very successful. And I would actually like to see something like this kind of brought back today. They kind of did it for a while with Extreme Expose, but I don't know. I don't really think that it would take away from the women's wrestling because, like in UFC, you have the women fighters and you have like the ring girls, and I think something like this would actually be pretty cool today and kind of add to the show.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I actually think it would work today more than it worked back then because it's funny. You and I watched '98 Nitro recently. It was fun to see them on there, but like every time they came out, I would look at the crowd just kind of see how they were reacting. It's like you got some people into it. It was like they just didn't know how to react if that makes sense. It's like they weren't sure what to make of this. It's weird. It's like you know what I mean?
I don't know. They were over. I mean, there was like one point where they even gave them a pay-per-view because of how over they
No, no, no.
were.
I don't mean they weren't over then. I just mean like in general, just like look at the fans. I think sometimes in those stands, and it's kind of one of those things where it happens in wrestling sometimes, but not even just with women. I think in like when we look at those concert acts or anything that goes on, it's like wrestling fans have this weird thing. Like obviously, like like if even just relating to you and I, if you and I were like at a wrestling show and like some like popular act was like doing this weird dance or something, you and I are probably not gonna be the people who like dance back and stuff like that. You know what I mean?
It depends on who it is. If I like them, maybe, but
Yeah, but I mean like like if like they have like Wiz Khalifa on there. I don't know if
no,
you
I'm not dancing to
exactly.
that.
See, it's like one of those things where I think as a wrestling fan sometimes you gotta kind of condition them to that where it's like obviously they don't have to dance or any of that, but you kind of condition them to that. I think today it would work so much better because you mentioned like you have like the ring girls and stuff, and I think in general today's culture would just be much more in tune like with the wrestling fans to kind of get into that and be kind of like it's cool to see this. Whereas I think back then people were just kind of like getting into that and kind of getting into that whole idea of like seeing this. I do think they were popular, obviously, like you said, they had the pay-per-view and the calendar and stuff, but it just seemed like sometimes wrestling fans don't really know how to react to that. I think today they really
I,
would.
I don't know if I agree with that because that was like a time where like wrestling was filled with like casual fans and it was just kind of like cheerleaders, you know. I
That's
don't
true.
I don't I
Maybe it
don't
was just
really
that. Go ahead.
I don't really think it's similar to like a Wiz Khalifa concert or anything at all.
Maybe it was just that one show, but I kept looking at the crowd. It just didn't look like there was anyone like moving around to that. I mean, like there were some, but it just felt like the crowd was largely just standing there. Maybe they were just gawking. Maybe they're just gawking at the women. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I looked too much into the crowd, but I was kind of just curious about that because I'm like, I'm kind of interested in this to see how this does for the time period, like to see kind of like how the crowd would react to this. And it's like they came out, they would dance. It's like the crowd, either they were fixated on them or they just didn't know how to react. It was weird. Like it was just kind of weird watching that because you look at the rest of the show and you just hear like these clear reactions. So
I liked it though. It added like a lively atmosphere to the show, and it was just kind of nice to have something to kind of break up things in between the matches. And they kind of added just excitement to the show, I thought.
yeah, definitely. I would definitely love that, like on the third hour of Raw, where they kind of like just bring something out to energize the crowd. Because I definitely think you lose something during the third hour of Raw, where you just kind of like just you just see. I've seen so much wrestling and so much angles and segments. I think something like that would just like it'd be different. You'd be like, oh, look, they come out to energize the crowd. I think that could really work today. I think more than ever it could work in a 3 hour show if you did it right. I wouldn't really want to overexpose them though, because I feel like you could easily do that, where it's like you would just want to be like, oh man, I got to see the I don't know what you call it, whatever you would call them. You would just see them. You'd be like, oh, I'm excited to see them. They're out. You wouldn't really want them to over the whole show, but if you had them in the right spots, I think it definitely could be add to the show.
And then the WWE, they kind of ended up bringing back the women's championship like around '98, and they kind of started to let them wrestle a little more. They had Sable wrestle, and they gave her the title, and I think that's fine because she was like the most over woman at the time, and her matches weren't really great, but I thought for what they were, I mean, she did fine. I thought.
Yeah, she's probably the best person to put the title on, even though she wasn't really like she's not the greatest wrestler. You're not really gonna get like the 5-star match out of her. But again, you don't always need champions who can do that. You just if they're popular, you can just ride that. And I definitely think they did that. They made her the face of the division. I think it kind of like you said, kind of brought women's wrestling to the forefront again because you put on someone who's over and you let them build the title rather than like the title building them.
Unfortunately, when she left, the title kind of fell off. But at least they did keep it around. They had like Ivory and Tori and Jacqueline kind of going for it, and it was like they kind of gave it a little time, but it was kind of like the old days where it was almost like WCW in the mid '90s, where it's like it was around, but it just didn't really get any focus, and like maybe they'd come out like once a month, and it just didn't really feel like a huge deal. But like one other woman that really stood out around that time was China. And I'm talking actually before she went for the women's title, because I actually think around the time she started to go for the women's title was when she started to lose popularity. But when she was like going at it with the guys and stuff, and like she came out as like a Royal Rumble entrant, like she was getting really over there for a while, and then she won the Intercontinental title. Some people kind of have mixed thoughts on that, but it was different, and people like that. People like the fact that they had like this big woman that could go at it with the guys, and it was just a very unique situation.
Yeah, definitely. I was gonna kind of say on that point before with like Ivory and them. Kind of one of the things you and I have been looking at like back a lot of shows in that time period. Kind of one of the things I noticed is that the women's division at that time was kind of this weird like gimmicky novelty act type of thing where it's like you didn't have these serious feuds or company. You had like Moolah and Mae Young going after like Ivory and beating her down, and
Yeah.
it's like in a sense it kind of draws attention, and in a sense it kind of like works for what it is. But in another sense, it's like it's not really what you would expect for a women's division. You kind of have like these mud matches and these putty matches, and again for
I
the
don't
time. Go ahead.
I don't think they really knew how to write for women. I'm not even sure they know how to write for women now, but
No.
it's like back then, it's like they understood that they didn't know how to write for women, so it's like they tried to keep it as limited as possible because like you have these guys in like suits that just you're trying to write for these women and it's just not gonna work.
Yeah, and to be honest, when they did right for the women, it kind of like even to this day, when not to knock on the guy at all, but it's like like someone like Vince Russo, who like watched a lot of Jerry Springer, or used that stuff, or even ECW
Yeah.
mentioned as inspiration. Like he's gonna write women the same way, where it's like they're just catty and constantly getting in the fights. And it's like there's just that style of women that doesn't work today, where it's like even main, we'll get into that today, but it's like even main roster WWE does that today, where they kind of just write these women in this catty way, where they're just like acting like they're mid to 90 early or late 90s, mid 2000s women of like Talk to the Hand and stuff like that, where it's like you don't really have that today in society. Women aren't like that. Women are more progressive. They're more, there's more of a movement there, and it's like they don't write to that. They write more to what they know, like you said. There's not really.
Well,
It,
here's my thoughts on that. I hate to kind of cut you off, but I want to say this. I'm fine with a little bit of that. Like, I think it's fine that they have like Lana and Summer Rae doing that. But if they had like the actual women's division with like the title scene, like if they wrote them better, because the fact that they have them acting catty and stuff, that that I think that's a bad thing. But if they just had like one thing on the show, like the Lana and Summer Rae thing, I'd be fine with that. I mean, I think that there are probably some women that are like that. I just want variety, really.
no, I definitely do see what you're saying, but I really think I think we just need to hire a female writer. I think they need, an actual
Absolutely.
female writer. Maybe it doesn't even have to be someone with a wrestling background. It could just even be someone from like Hollywood or something. But just put a
They
female
actually
voice in
had
there.
one for a while, didn't they? Like Jen something?
I think they did. I kind of remember. I don't think it was her, but I remember like this one story. I think it was like JB out on it, where like it had like this female writer from like Nickelodeon, and she was like trying to ask all these questions about like wrestling being fake or something like that, like the fake blood and like is it like
Oh.
ketchup or something like that. So it's like sometimes you don't get the best representatives, but I would love to see like a female like actual voice like writing and kind of overseeing the division because I think that would help. And I've seen that said a lot. I've seen people not just say it for women, but I've seen people say it for like minorities too, like the Hispanic market. It seems like everyone has that go-to Hispanic gimmick of like, oh, let's make them the gangster guys, or let's make them this, or let's make, the cliche gimmicks where it's like, you
Or
always
like
have,
Alberto, where it's like he's talking about how much he loves the United States and all this stuff.
exactly, it's like you always have these cliche gimmicks where they don't really know how to work them. And I think that's just down to you need more minorities in there. You need minorities in there to kind of voice their opinions because they know better than anyone how to relate to these people. When you don't, like you said, you kind of have like these older guys in suits who've been around forever and kind of have their own one mind track mindset that are old. It's like they're not going to know how to write current day to day. It's like I think that's just like you said, like a major problem of today.
Then things kind of changed for the better. We got Trish Stratus and Lita, and they were like the big two names for a couple years. When they first debuted, they were kind of valets more. Like Trish was with TNA, Test and Albert, and Lita was with the Hardys, and she was actually with SA Rios originally. But Lita kind of started to get people's attention because she started to do like some of those high flying moves, like in the middle of like SA Rios or the Hardys matches, and then they started to let like Trish and Lita go at it, and they had like this famous rivalry. And I'll get into like what the women's division actually grew into more like a year or two later. But what were like your initial thoughts on Trish and Lita?
See, I think they both of those were perfectly for what they were. I think obviously at the time Trish was more the valet, like you said. I guess I'll get more into her as a wrestler later, but I always thought they kind of presented Trish in the right way in general, of kind of being like like she always had the looks, and you always kind of focus on beauty, but she also kind of came off like smart and intelligent in the sense of like being conniving.
Yeah,
Like with TNA, she always came out like the whole Dudley feud, where it's like obviously it was based around her looks and her trying to court Bubba Ray, but the fact that she would try and do that and kind of like use him, manipulate him, that's how you use that, and that's how you do something different, where you make a woman seem powerful and you make him seem like this strong character. I think that's kind of why, even though it took her a while to actually become like one of the bigger stars, I think that's kind of why she stood out and kind of why it worked. And the same thing with Lita, where it's like you had this girl who did things that people weren't doing at the time, where you kind of had her doing like the valet thing, and she was like, kind of like China mixing up with men. You kind of had her mixing it up with the men too, where she would kind of like do her spots and do these, the Hurricane Rana or the moonsault. It's just like something you didn't see at the time from the women, because they obviously, like we said, they weren't really pushing the women's wrestling on the mainstream level that much. So you kind of got that stuff, and it was like so different at the time. Eventually, like you said, we'll talk about their feud, but eventually when they did meet up, even in those tag team feuds, it kind of just was this perfect clash of characters. You had the conniving, heel girl who was, who would manipulate people, and you had this, outside of the box kind of different, extreme girl who would do all these crazy moves. It was just kind of like this perfect mixture and balance.
yeah, I think you're spot on with Trish because it's like she did like they did like sexualize her, but it was done on her own terms.
Exactly.
It was she came off as this smart like layered character, whereas before it was just kind of like women would come out in like a wet t-shirt and they're like, "Oh, I'm wearing a wet t-shirt," and it's like that was like their whole character.
Exactly. It was more, again, like I said with ECW, it was more being controversial for the sake of being controversial, coming out like that. Whereas like with Trish, it was more calculated, more like I'm doing this because I'm going to help my guys win, more so than I'm doing this just because I can.
Man, Alexa Bliss really is a lot like her.
I was thinking I was going to bring that up in the present day, where it's like Alexa Bliss reminds me of like her, because that's exactly what they're doing now with the tag team. And she just kind of needs that foil. I wonder who that could be, but she kind of needs a foil to be the leader of the thing.
I don't think Blue Pants is going to be the leader, with all due
No,
respect to her.
but I think it could be one of the main roster girls. I think maybe you always have Paige, who kind of is different. You kind of have Becky Lynch, who's a different face. You have all kinds of different like characters where I think you could do it. It's just a matter of letting them click first. Obviously things get better.
Then the women's division kind of started to grow. They started to bring in more women like Victoria and Molly Holly and Jazz. And for like a couple of years, they were having really good matches. And not only were they having good matches, but they were having good stories there. Like Trish and Victoria had a great feud. And I wasn't always crazy about the way that they presented Molly, but, they had stories and Jazz had stories. They all had stories, and they had to have good matches. And it was just nice. And it was getting over. And a lot of people kind of look at like TNA and like the Knockouts division. We'll get into that as like kind of like the period where it kind of opened people's eyes that women's wrestling was good. But I would actually argue that this period was kind of the period that really showed off like how good the women's division could be.
Yeah, definitely. Again, you always had, Trish was more the face this time around, but you always had her presented in this, this dignified way. Like I don't want to go the Elizabeth route, because obviously she did a lot more like overly stuff, overly sexual stuff.
Yes, we should mention that Vince brought her into the ring and had her stripped down to her underwear
Yeah.
and bark like a dog at one point. So
But this was
wasn't
after that.
perfect.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
what I mean is just like they kind of still had her in that way where she was like classy and elegant. She kind of did that stuff, but she was kind of more, because on SmackDown, like at the time when you had like the brand split, SmackDown had more of the women that were kind of more the eye candy, like the Tori and the Dawn Maries and girls like that. Whereas like Raw had more, like you said, the competition and more women's. Obviously they had their bikini contests and stuff like that too on there, but it was more just the competition route. And Trish came off as this presentable champion, where she was like, obviously you liked her because she looked attractive, but you also liked her because she was good, and she held that title, and they treated her like a champion. They kind of.
And you know what I liked about that too was that every once in a while, like they would like put together like those bra and panties matches, and like Trish or whoever would get annoyed by this, like on
Exactly.
screen, they'd be like, "Really, another bra and panties match?" It was kind of funny, just kind of a a difference from like the past where like it seemed like the women's whole motivation was to go out and like strip down to their underwear.
Exactly, and it's just one of those things where, they had, like you said, they had like a lot of different characters. They had, Victoria, they had Ivory. Ivory was still around. They had Jacqueline. They had all these women that could, wrestle, that could actually have these good competitive matches. And it's like they kind of had their role in the show, and even, eventually later on main evented. But it's kind of they just that period of wrestling had just such a perfect mixture of characters and mixing in everything with that. It's just like obviously it was never like I mean, obviously for its time, it was kind of one of those things where you look at it and, people still look at that as kind of like the golden age of women's wrestling. Obviously now it's getting a lot of attention again, but it's like, and the knockouts did too, but it's like people just looked at that as like the standard bearer for wrestling. I could see why. I mean, obviously he had such a strong character base. It wasn't perfect because, like you said, they had like the Molly Holly stuff and even the Gail Kim stuff. Like as much as they tried to get her over as the face originally, it just didn't click, and they kind of had to turn her heel. But there was
HLA.
yeah, yeah, dude, that was kind of the byproduct of the Molly thing, where it was like, at the time you kind of had this weird mixture of like them presenting women more seriously, but they still had that like shock value style where they wanted to do all this controversial stuff to be controversial, and it kind of worked against it in some ways, like HLA or like making fun of Molly's body and stuff like that. It's just like it was kind of like it wasn't perfect at the time, but it was really good. Probably like in terms of like quality, in terms of like just characters and stories put into it, one of the most booming times for women's wrestling.
And then I think the Diva Search kind of killed things, unfortunately. Like
Oof.
every once in a while, you'd have someone like Candice Michelle come around, and she actually kind of improved and got pretty decent, I thought. And you also had like Mickey James and Melina and Beth Phoenix, so you did still have like good women's wrestling, and they still kind of had characters, so it wasn't quite dead yet, but it was definitely a step down from like that 2002 to like 2004 period, and it just kind of you could tell they were kind of losing interest there.
Okay, so we're talking about like the basically just the mid 2000s, late 2000s, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about like that period where it's like they started to do more of that like Divas division stuff or the Divas
No, no, I know what you mean, but I'm just trying to like figure out the time period so I know where to like kind of go off
yeah,
because you
like
mentioned like
I'd say
Melina and
probably
Mickey, so.
like 2005 to like 2010 or so.
Okay,
Cuz I think 2010 is when it really started to go off the rails, but this was like this period where it was a step down from like those like prime days where it was like really good, but it was like it wasn't quite what it could be or should be.
yeah, but there's definitely shining moments, and I'll get to one of those soon. But in terms of the Diva Search, that was one of those things that kind of set things back a long time because even like you kind of mentioned like, oh, I'm sure there are women who are catty out there like that. You're not wrong in that because if you go back and look at
Yeah.
that unscripted Just the Diva segment, that
Carmella,
yeah, I watched that not long ago and I was still amazed by that. Not even Carmella, it's just like the whole
Christy Hemme.
yeah. Do you remember that
Oh,
whole segment? It was just like just one like cliche like thing after another and the words that you would never hear uttered on like you never think you'd hear uttered on WWE TV that will never be
dude,
uttered again.
we were around during the Attitude Era, so we kind of like had some we'd seen a lot of stuff, and it was kind of hard for us to like be shocked. But I remember like my eyes widened at
Yeah.
some of the stuff that I would see on this stuff.
No, not even C, dude. Here, I mean, I'm talking about that
Yeah,
classic line. Yeah, but yeah, that was quite the setback, and obviously they kind of had to shift to where they kind of did that. But actually, one of the things that actually got me like really into women's wrestling, like 'cause I liked it in the early 2000s, but it was kind of like I liked it more for like just genuine like hear their characters more so than like the actual like just full out division. Because I appreciate that more within time more than I did at the time. But one thing is that really got me into that, and just because like it was a story, I mean, it wasn't a perfect story by any means. It was kind of like a little bit out there, but it was that Trish and
Nikki and Trish.
yeah, exactly. That was the one
Yep.
feud that really just got me kind of going with that, kind of thinking like, you know what, this is just like just these women are getting time. They're telling this feud. It's not always perfect, but it's like it just makes sense. You kind of get the idea of it, and logically it makes sense, and you're kind of into it. And these matches are
I actually remember going into that WrestleMania that you and I and like a lot of other people were saying that that was like the angle that we were like most into
exactly.
going into WrestleMania because I remember that I was like Cena and Triple H, which I didn't really think was that great of a feud, and like Edge and Mick Foley was pretty good, but like a lot of the other stuff on the show just wasn't that good. And then you had this like great like layered angle that you just don't get stuff like that anymore.
And see, that's kind of another thing where it's like we kind of talked about controversial being controversial. We talked about HLA. HLA was them trying to be shock value, but this touched on kind of like a weird dynamic there with like Mickey, liking Trish, but it was done in a way where it wasn't being done to kind of exploit that and like, oh, here's for the male. I mean, even though they did do some stuff like that, it was kind of like, it was more, it had a point, it had a story, it had a way it was going, and it made sense. And I think it was done in more of a, more of a way where you could kind of get into it, more of a way where it just kind of made sense with the story and kind of, clicked with it. And the whole Mickey James dynamic was kind of just something you'd see like this psycho girl stalking the popular wrestler, and it just made for this compelling feud. And it's just something where it got so much time. It felt like they every week they kind of had like a plan with it. They kind of like advanced in some way or form. They kind of even put some of the other women in it. You kind of mentioned the Diva Search. They kind of put in like Ashley Massaro in there, and
Yep.
some other women in there, and it's like they gave them a role. They had like a role on the show. They had like a part of the show. They weren't like all over the show, but they had like their segments and their roles, and it just worked. It clicked. It was like just perfectly done. And it's like ever since
I
then,
love how over the top it went
yeah,
sometimes, like when Trish was like dating that dude and like Mickey like tied him up and she like has him
yeah,
under the box. That was great.
yeah, exactly. Stuff like that to me, it's like that's when I got into women's wrestling because even beyond just in-ring aspect, because even then, like it was really good. Obviously, you had Mickey and Trish having great matches, and the WrestleMania match was really great. You go back and watch that, but even beyond that, they just had like this story that made sense, and it was just one of those few times it clicked in my head, that women's wrestling could really be something if they really try to make it that way with these strong characters. But it's just like, it's just one of those things that grew over time. Obviously, as the Knockouts division got going, all these other things got going, but that feud set the standard for that. In terms of the rest of the time, you had your
Well,
mixture. Go ahead.
let me say something else about that. The only thing that I didn't really like about that, and this is kind of a nitpick, but I would have liked if they actually kind of like developed that dude more instead of just bringing him in one week. Like, and he was like this. You could tell he wasn't like the most charismatic dude. It was like they just kind of brought him in like out of nowhere, like one week, and like Trish was like, "Oh, this is like Jack or whatever his name was. Like I'm dating him." Like I think it would have been cool if they kind of like touched more on that and like had like Trish like starting to like fall for this guy and like Mickey's like getting more and more jealous. I think they could have done some cool things there, but that's nitpicking.
When I look back at that, I actually think that would have been a heck of a debut for like a wrestler or something, where you could kind of put him in the role,
Yeah.
and obviously you can build like maybe even an intergender match or something like that for the time, or just just get this guy going with like this weird character, like being involved in this, and he kind of like goes from there where he kind of becomes like this wrestler on the roster. But it's like you would just think like I agree with you. I think you like a role like that would be perfect for a guy. I mean, I don't know who. I don't really remember like developmental at the time, but it's like you could have had someone in that role where it's like you could have easily debuted him in that role, and you could have had him look good in this role, and he could have easily, I don't want to say built a star, but he could easily have gotten a guy with name value off of this one role.
I wonder how much sooner like Frankie Kazarian would have quit if they like made him that guy.
I don't even know if he'd quit. I mean, as bad of like as weird of a role as it was, again, you'd be getting like attention, you'd be getting like over from this
Yeah,
feud. So,
absolutely.
but yeah, again with the rest of the 2000s, it's kind of like it's like you had your mixture. You had kind of Diva Search stuff, but I do think there was like some highlights to that. I guess this kind of falls under that category, but you kind of had women like even from the Diva Search perspective, you kind of like women like Eve Torres come along and kind of be kind of the interviewer at first, but kind of get better over time. And obviously her heel character towards the end was kind of great. And you had Michelle McCool for all her misgivings was really good in the ring. She wasn't always like the best personality, all the play cool stuff kind of like fixed that a little bit, but
Yeah, and even like Candice Michelle, I mentioned her. There was
yeah.
a period where I actually thought Candice got like pretty dang good.
Yeah, her and Beth Phoenix, I remember, had a really fun series of matches. You had a Maurice, who was never really the best wrestler, but her character just kind of like carried
I'll
things.
get
And
to her. I'm gonna kind of count her more in the next era,
okay,
but
okay,
yeah.
I didn't know how far we were going with that, but yeah. Anyways, I thought like for the time period, I think you had like a lot of hit or miss. I think you kind of had some really strong characters. I think you kind of had some their characters, and actually, I'd be like, are we talking in general here? Or are we going to go into like the knockouts and stuff after that, or what are we doing?
We got a lot of stuff we still got to get into. We
No,
got
no, I just mean
Shimmer.
like in this time period, like in this one
No,
time period.
we're just talking like WWE. I'll actually move on
Okay.
here.
Well, hold on. I got one more thing to say because I was going to say this
Okay.
because I remember this from the time because it kind of counts with WWE. I remember too at the time OVW had some pretty unique women's stuff going on at the time too because they had like the Katie Lee and Beth Phoenix ladder match at the
Yeah,
time.
ladder match.
Yeah, that was like I remember hearing a lot about that promotion. It's kind of funny
It
because
was actually on that ladder match DVD because I actually remember seeing that.
I remember that being on there, and it's like I remember a lot of buzz about that division at the time. Like even predating like the whole big women's wrestling aspect. It's like I just remember hearing a lot about that division and kind of the characters that were there and kind of the it wasn't perfect, but they kind of had stuff going on with them too and doing these revolutionary things. So I want to give that a shout out because I remember that was like heavily talked about at the time.
One big thing that changed for women's wrestling in the mid 2000s was Shimmer was formed, and a lot of like spin-offs have come off over the years, like spin-off promotions like Shine and like they have a lot of women's promotions now, but Shimmer was kind of the ones that they were kind of the ones that really got it going. And obviously, you and me, we can speak quite a lot on Shimmer because we've actually been to quite a few of those tapings. We've been a fan of the product for years, and I feel like they played a big part in kind of changing like a lot of people's perceptions. I mean, it was kind of a small niche thing. Like a lot of people, even today, like I don't think that a lot of people have even seen Shimmer, which is kind of a shame because that really is like some of the best women's wrestling that I've ever seen. But just I think they did a lot of really great things for women's wrestling.
Shimmer at the time was a female like ROH of of the
Exactly.
independents, where it kind of brought together a bunch of international women and kind of just American independent women who were kind of spotlighted on various indies like in their area, but were never really spotlighted at a major level. And they kind of gave them this big exposure on DVDs. And obviously now DVDs are kind of like kind of hit. They're not really as prevalent today as they used to be. It's more about streaming, but it speaks volumes that Shimmer can even stay afloat in the DVD market because that's how they market their stuff outside of like the iPay-per-view here or there. But it's one of those things where you look at that and the impact of that at the time was huge because you had like a lot of these these women's wrestlers on the independents. They were they were kind of getting exposure on like smaller shows. Like I remember like IW Mid. Remember like Shimmer itself was formed because of some tournament IWA Mid South had at the time, where they kind of like put all these women's
Yeah, Dave Prazak was actually booking that himself.
yeah, exactly. They had like that tournament, and they used a lot of those women, and they kind of just it spun off from there. And it's like it actually used quite a few WWE women that now in past that were there, like Beth Phoenix and Natalia and various others. It's been one of those things where it's been kind of a great launching pad, kind of like I mentioned ROH. It's been one of those launching pads for independent stars to get a name for themselves and actually go move on to WWE because there's been like a ton of them that have been signed and moved on. So it's just an amazing place to develop talent and bring them to the forefront.
Yeah, you look at so many women that are on WWE TV today, like Paige
Becky
and
Lynch,
Becky Lynch, Bailey. They were all in Shimmer.
yep, and even some past ones. You have like Serena. You have a whole bunch of them you could even say,
Yep.
but
Jessie McKay.
exactly. There's just a ton of them that have actually been signed off of that and just noticed from that. So it broke ground. It was like at the time it was one of those things where it just kind of you and I heard about it early on. It's kind of like, oh, this is pretty cool, but we never really watched it. But it's just the impact at the time it had. It's just so amazing when you look back on it and see the time it was really the big women's the big women's wrestling promotion that actually grew attention and spotlight a lot of these women who were talented. You would obviously hear about them on the internet. You kind of hear like their names in various areas, but it brought them all together and let them shine.
And for anyone that's never seen Shimmer, I think a good description of it would be this: like you take some of those like NXT Takeover special matches now, and basically like imagine like an entire card full of those. And I'm not saying like every single match on the card was that way because they had a good mixture of stuff. They put a lot of work into the characters and stuff, and they would have some matches that they weren't really meant to be like these blowaway matches, but they were just kind of meant to just be fun and kind of get you into it. But like all of the top matches, like they were just like amazing quality, and they brought in a lot of women from Japan. They brought in a lot of women from like Australia, from the United Kingdom, some of the best from the United States, just all over the world. And they're still doing this to this day, although I haven't seen it in a while, unfortunately. But it really is like some of the best women's wrestling that I've ever seen. And I think even now, looking at some of these like blowaway matches on like the NXT shows, it's like I don't know that anything will ever top the Shimmer stuff for me.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things where I think if more people saw that, it's like you see those takeover matches, you're like, man, this is amazing. But it's like you've also seen some amazing matches in Shimmer, so it's kind of like, I don't know if it's the most amazing women's match I've ever saw, but for WWE, sure. But it's like, you always have that mindset, and they created so many great moments, and it's just like, we were there for a lot of them, and on our other, we talk about sometimes for our other podcasts, Pancake, but we actually, talked a little bit about our Shimmer experiences on our trips and stuff like that in past shows, and we always have these great memories of kind of what happened there, kind of these matches, because obviously they tape kind of like 4 hours per, or 4 volumes per weekend, which is like 6 hours per day, basically over 2 days. So it's like a lot of wrestling, but there's always a match that always gets you pumped up and into it, even when you're feeling kind of tired.
And they were good at storytelling too, because for like the longest time, like cheerleader Melissa couldn't win the title, and we were actually there when she won her first Shimmer title. And that was honestly like you've been to WrestleManias and stuff, so maybe it's not the same for you. I've been to like some Raws and stuff, but I don't think I've ever been like there for a moment like as just I don't even know how to describe it, but like that moment when she won the title, like that whole building just went nuts. It's not a huge building. This was like I don't know, like maybe 200 people at the most, but it was like everybody was going crazy. The emotion was crazy. That I've never experienced anything quite like that before.
Yeah, I think the small setting actually helps moments like that stand out because you kind of, it's more personal in the sense you kind of have that connection with people around you. I remember that too. I remember like people going nuts and like throwing their arms in the air and people just like just going crazy over this. There's just an amazing
High
moment.
fiving.
Exactly, amazing moment to look back on and just kind of, it's one of those things where you kind of get that now where you get like, the Bailey win where she kind of has like this emotional moment, but it's like you get those with that too. It's like
Absolutely.
you build these connections and you have these storylines that play out. And granted, they're not always the most major storylines. They're kind of basic sometimes, but it kind of works because you kind of go volume by volume, and eventually you connect a story in the dots. And if you're a DVD follower and you get like every DVD, you kind of every DVD tells a different story and leads to something in the future. It's like you just have all these interesting characters and angles. And one of the fun parts I think for me is seeing wrestlers come together in the promotion because you look at someone like a Bailey who's kind of like a rookie there and kind of getting going and kind of just being, kind of not even really having a character, just kind of being like the understudy to Serena D. But, as a wrestler, she was kind of improving there and getting better and better. And she goes to WWE and she puts a character together like Bailey. And it's like, it's like this sense of like, just, I don't want to say proud, but it's kind of like this sense of like, man,
Oh, it is proud.
yeah, it's like you just see someone progress so much. Like even like an Emma too, who again was a really promising wrestler, but never really have a character to connect. It's like Shimmer prepares you for that. It gets you like a little bit of a character, and it gets you kind of in ring. It really gets you like working with these great women, and you kind of take that knowledge. It's kind of like you go to WWE and you're gonna put it together, and you get like those takeover matches, and you get like these characters put together. It's just an amazing place to put together like the all around package.
Also around that time was when the TNA Knockouts division really started to kick off, and this was a big thing. I remember like 2007, 2008, like this was like all anybody was talking about in the wrestling world was the Knockouts division. And like you had those like matches with Gail Kim and Awesome Kong. I think those were probably the most memorable matches. But you also had a lot of other great women around. Like we mentioned cheerleader Melissa with Shimmer, like she was around. You had Sarita around, Taylor Wilde. There was just a lot of good women, a lot of good wrestlers, a lot of good matches, and it was just really fun. And it even grew to the point where they had like knockouts tag titles. And I think like around like that 2009 period was kind of the peak, which is unfortunately that was also around the time that they had that Jenna Maraska match, which so it wasn't perfect, but it was like it was treated seriously. They were given like multiple segments on every show, and they were like the highest rated segments on the show. It was really like this. I hate to use this term, but it was kind of like a women's revolution.
When we look back on it, it kind of reminds me of like a little bit of that Alondra Blaze and Bull Nakano period that we talked about. Because when you look at Kong and Gale, it's kind of the same dynamic where you have kind of like this veteran wrestler in Gale and kind of this big Amazon woman in Kong who had like this unique look, and it kind of worked in that way. They just kind of have these matches that clicked. They're both kind of at their best. It's like you had all these other women around them. You had like the beautiful people who weren't really well. Angelina was pretty good back, in the early days, and Velvet wasn't bad, but it's like you kind of had like this tag team that just kind of worked with their characters and clicked at
You
the
know
same
what I
time.
liked about the Beautiful People is they kind of were like the WWE divas,
Yeah,
but they were like the only ones, so they
exactly.
stood out because you had like this whole division full of wrestlers, but then you had like these two like diva-like women, and they would get big heat, and they were like doing these awesome segments and then this awesome character work, and they really stood out so much so that they like got WWE's attention, who tried to make their own version with Lake Cool.
Exactly. You kind of had that dynamic, and you had like the Voodoo Queen. I remember you had like
Yeah.
a whole bunch of different gimmicks that were just unique. And again, it was kind of like a mixture of everything. It was kind of like you had the great women's wrestling that you would expect on the independents or the early '90s we talked about with WWE. You had kind of the characters that glow where you kind of had like these over the top kind of different characters. You had
ODB.
ODB. You had all these different characters and stories. You had stories with them. You had different dynamics. It's just like you had this perfect mixture of everything like a women's you know division should be. And it's like for that period of peak it lasted, it was really entertaining to watch, and it was kind of exciting because it would. Kind of like any promotions, kind of like they would bring in all these, different women to have like tryout match. You'd be like, I wonder who's going to appear next, and you kind of have like all these different various women, indie women's wrestlers appear, and you're kind of like, oh, that's awesome, and you're kind of just like glued to this, looking at it, and it's kind of like, just for its time period, it was just so amazing to see, and it kind of like, really got that thought of like women's wrestling to mainstream going.
And then, as often is the case in wrestling, they killed it.
Yep.
Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan came in, and I feel like they didn't really understand it. They tried to make it more like WWE's, and it just didn't work. And I feel like they've never really recovered from that. Like even today, it's like they present it like they're still like the knockouts from their prime, but it's like it's just never really recovered from what Bischoff and Hogan did.
Honestly, today it's more like mid '90s mid '90s. No, probably more early 2000s WWE than it is like mid '90s, where it's like like you said, they try and present it seriously, but they also have like all this like it's good again, like we said, to have like some sexual content, but it's like they kind of overdo that, where like they have the camera,
Yeah.
like you just watching the match, it's just like camera angles are always on the like direct places and kind of like strategic place. And don't get me wrong, like obviously you want to focus on a woman's looks and stuff like that to kind of draw attention, but it's like you don't want that the whole match. You want people to actually take it seriously, and it's like it's hard to take it seriously like that, even though they have some entertaining characters. They just don't really have the same talent. They don't really have the same they don't have the same all-around package they once had. It's like you kind of, like you mentioned with the beautiful people, where they kind of had like just one act like that. It feels like they kind of just have like a few women that just go around looking attractive, and it's kind of like, it just doesn't really work as well as it used to.
And don't get me wrong, they did do some good stuff like after the 2010. Like they
Oh
had
yeah,
Mickie James come in. She had a great run in TNA, like especially that period where she was like a heel for a while. She
her
was
and
like
Gail
doing
feud.
some of
I
the
remember that.
yeah, she was like doing like some of the best work of her career. And like even now, like you'll get some good stuff here and there. It's kind of rare these days, but it's like they're trying, like the women are trying, but it's just I just feel like it's a lot of old guys that just don't really get what it's supposed to be. That was the
Yeah.
case with Bischoff and Hogan. I feel like it didn't really improve that much with Pritchard. And now you have John Gaburk, and I feel like he doesn't really get it either, and it's just it's sad.
It feels kind of stagnant too, because it's like, yeah, you bring in some like a couple of new people here or there, like Jade and Marty, or even Terrence still has some like unique matches, but it's like you also have so many girls that have been there, and they're kind of facing each other over and over again, to where it's like you're okay with it, but it's like it'd be nice if they brought in some new talent, and revitalize the division a little bit. But obviously TNA are having like their financial issues and stuff, so you can't really expect that. But it's
Well,
like,
they brought in like Mia Yim
yeah,
and
that's what I
Marty
said, Jade and
Bell.
Marty, yeah.
Yeah, it's like I actually like the Dollhouse. I think it's kind of a unique kind of act, but it's like they have Gail Kim destroying them in handicap matches. Why are they not pushing these two?
And it's like they don't really have like standout matches. Like they're like some of them could be good, but it's like they're not really like I've seen better like Mia Yim matches on the Independents. I haven't really seen a lot of
Yeah.
Marty, so I can't say her, but like I've seen a lot of great Mia Yim matches in the Independents. It's just like let her go in there with like a I don't know like Kong or someone else and just have a great match. It's like instead it's kind of like more gimmicky.
And then going back to WWE, things just kind of continued to get worse. Like Maurice, you mentioned her. She had the title for a while, and she was a really entertaining character, but she just wasn't the best wrestler. Kelly got a push. The Bellas got a push. And I actually think there have been points where a lot of these women have actually improved and shown something in there. But they're put in like these 3-minute matches where it's like they have to rush through all their spots and they're told to wrestle a certain way. And it's just not really an environment where you're going to thrive in. And it's like a lot of people will pick on the Bellas now, and I can understand that because it's kind of a perception thing. And I don't think like the Bellas are like these amazing wrestlers or anything, but Nikki Bella is pretty good. And I thought there was a period for a while where Kelly was improving, and it's like, I'd be fine with, giving them a chance, but it's like they're not really in an environment where they're going to be given a chance to be at their best.
See, that's kind of the problem with Maurice back in the day. It's like she had a great character, but they didn't really push. Like they kind of pushed the character, but not really, to the point where you could easily. Not like Sable, where like Sable had like that. She wasn't the best wrestler, but she had like a character and she was over. Whereas like Maurice was more just like she had a character, but they wouldn't really do like a whole lot of unique stuff to advance that. Obviously they would kind of limit it time wise and throw the women out there in like these big tag matches for like 2 minutes, 3 minutes at a time, and
Dude, there was like a period, I think it was like 2012, where like all we saw for like 6 months was like a big 6 or 8
yep,
woman tag every single week.
for like 2 minutes, and that'd be it. But yeah, it's weird that like we kind of just have this weird thing where it's like obviously the Bellas do get cast in a bad light. It's just kind of like it's like things are just so stale. I think in a lot of ways where it's like
Yeah.
the Bellas have been around forever, and even though there's like new opponents for them to face, you're kind of like we've seen them for like a long time, and that's not
I
to
think
knock.
they just represent an era that fans hate when it comes to women's wrestling.
Well, not just that, but it's like they're in a weird spot where it's like I think you have obviously someone like Nikki who's improved and is good, but it's like people want to see the NXT girls like light it up. They're just like in that mode, and it's like Nikki being champion, saying that record is one thing, but I think some people despise her for that because it's like, why does she get to do that? Why does she get to be the special one that does that? And I'm not saying whether she does or doesn't deserve it. That's obviously subjective to the person. But I think that gives her that bad rap because people are like, well, she's okay, but I like blah 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 better, and it's like, I kind of understand why people resent that, but I think it's like, I just think they're in a bad spot where they're just kind of cast in this bad light where they're the focal points, and I think people are kind of annoyed by that because they feel like these other women are better or whatever. And it's like WWE doesn't do enough to kind of like set that apart. They don't really. It's like you said, they don't really understand how to set that apart. It's kind of like Bellas or like Eva Marie will get a bad rap because they're put in these horrible spots that they shouldn't even be in, where it's like you should be maximizing their strengths, and it doesn't feel like WWE does that. Like obviously with all this flip flopping too, where it's like the Bellas are heel one week and then they're face the next, and
Yes.
they come out and they
Uh,
like. I'm sure I don't even blame them because I'm sure they're confused as we are. But it's like they come out one week talking about like, oh, I'm fearless, I'm dominant, I do this all for the people, and then the next week they're like, trying to turn Becky and Charlotte against each other, and it's like, what? What are you like? What is the goal here? Like, what are these people? It just doesn't make sense to me.
I remember there was like an internal memo that like people were talking about online where it was like, don't give these women characters, just have them all be catty and hate each other. And this is
Pretty
like a
much.
real memo that came out, and it's just so backwards, and it's like we'll get back to the main roster here. I want to talk about NXT first because NXT really was like the latest big thing where everybody got to talking about women's wrestling. And it's funny, you notice this like every couple of years. It's like women's wrestling will kind of take off, and it kind of shows that people really want to see it, but they just keep screwing it up. And I hope they don't screw it up with this. But getting to NXT here, it started out kind of unnoticed by a lot of people. You had Paige kind of making a name for herself on there. You had Emma and Bayley, and they were having these good matches, and they had these like really fun characters, and just kind of slowly but surely they started to get over, and people were starting to take notice of it, and they started to have like those takeover matches that really, it seems like they're always trying to top each other. And it's like now you get to this point where it's like these things are really over, and people really, really want to see this on the main roster. And then this summer they brought up like a bunch of the NXT women. They brought up Charlotte, they brought up Sasha, they brought up Becky, and it is what it is. I mean, they're not presenting it in a good way. I mean, a lot of people really want to see this work. I'd like to see it work, but it's like you look at that segment from Raw this week, or that Miz TV thing, where it's just like they're just all being catty and there's like no direction, and it's just like it's horrible, And I feel bad for the women, like Paige and like the Bellas were like tweeting about this, like blaming the crowd. I don't blame the crowd. I mean, I can see why the crowd were crapping on this. It was bad, and it's not their fault, but it's. I just hope it's sending a message to the company, but unfortunately, I don't think it is. I think the company are just looking at this, thinking, "Oh, we gave them a chance, but it's not working." It's like they don't really seem to realize that this isn't working because of them.
Honestly, dude, maybe they do realize it. Maybe you just gotta think like maybe this is like their elaborate plan to make this fail. Like you never know. I
I do
mean,
believe there are people in the company that are probably
exactly.
doing that, but I also believe there are
Oh
people
yeah,
that are just so caught up in their bubble that they actually think that what they're doing here is great. I think Stephanie's one of those people, honestly, because it's like she's so proud of this like women's revolution that she started, and it's like you just don't get it, lady.
yeah, but to me, it's kind of like one of those things where I just look at it and I kind of wonder, like maybe, like I always kind of wonder if there's like some type of jealousy issue with NXT because even looking at something like the Ascension, two guys who weren't really the best wrestlers, but you put them on like, when you look at them at NXT, they kind of have like this aura to them where they're kind of like the unbeaten champions and they have like this cool entrance and stuff. And look at the way they debuted them, and it's like they couldn't possibly think that was going to work, and they purposely made them jokes, and it's like I just kind of wonder if they have like this outright plan to be like, well, look, we're going to put this on our show, and it may work in their little minor league, but it's not going to work on our major league or something like that. It just kind of
There
strikes me
are
as that.
people within the company
Yeah,
that want it to fail. I don't think it's Vince. I don't think it's Stephanie. I don't know who it is. I'm not going to name names. Maybe Kevin Dunn, but there are people within this company that are looking at what's going on with Triple H, and they don't want to see WWE become that. In their minds, it's like, oh, what we're doing is fine. What we're doing, we're the big leagues. NXT is like developmental. We shouldn't
exactly.
try to be like them. They should try and be like us. And it's like, I don't really feel like Vince really knows what's going on. I really don't. I hate to say this, but I don't really think he knows what's good or bad anymore. And Stephanie, she just thinks this is great because it's like this big PR thing. Like we're starting this women's revolution. It's like they just don't get it. They don't get why it worked. they just don't get it. And it's like Triple H, I kind of feel like he gets it, but it's like I don't know. One guy can only do so much when there's just like this whole system. It's just it's not working.
I think one of the things that hurts it too is that like you have the majority of the women kind of on one team, like Becky and Charlotte, and you kind of have Sasha in the other team. But like even on Raw, like people wanted to see Sasha after that like amazing NXT match. They didn't even put her out there, which was a stupid thing on its own because you obviously try
Well,
to.
I can't blame them for that because she's hurt.
So
Like
she,
that match with Bailey actually took a lot out of her, and then like
I
she
heard
worked
she was
SummerSlam.
on. I heard she was on SmackDown though, but like doing commentary. But one of those things though, where it's like why couldn't she at least go out there like for the end of the match and just be like it's like maybe they didn't have it like in their script or maybe she was given a day off of it, which if so like that makes sense, but it's like to me it's like you don't even have her go out there and wrestle, just have her go out there and like be there, people want to see her, you know what I mean? It's like you have
I
something
hate that she's
momentum.
even in this team bad thing. I don't
Yeah,
even get why they're together. It's just like Stephanie just like brought them out and they're like, you're together now. And it's like, what kind of storytelling is that?
I couldn't tell you, but
I don't know why any of these people are together. I don't know why Alicia Fox is with the Bellas. I don't know why PCB are together. That's a horrible name, PCB, by the way. I don't think the submission sorority was much better even without the obvious reason why they changed it. It's just they they just don't get it.
yeah, and what I was getting at is that you have kind of two of those three women on the same team, and obviously they're not really interacting much with Sasha. I mean, they kind of do, but it's like people, there's so high expectations that, the main roster girls are unfortunately put in this situation where they kind of have to be at that level. And, they're not really used to that. They're barely getting used to these longer matches as it is. And, they're good, but it's like people are expecting great. That's kind of the problem, I think. It's like, you
And I
know,
think people kind of look at Charlotte as better than she actually is too, because you got to remember, like a lot of those matches in NXT, they were really put together now, and now she's in this position where it's like you don't really have that time to go over matches, and she just seems really in over her head.
yeah, I definitely could see that. I definitely see that with quite a lot of these women. Like, someone like Becky or even a Sasha could get like a decent match out of someone, but it feels like them too. Like they're kind of like they try and they're like doing their best, but they haven't really worked with these women a lot. And it's like one of those things where it's like even working with them on TV shows, it's just like you're not like this is like something where they probably should have like had them work on house shows for like a few months to kind of like get this over and kind of get them in a rhythm with these main roster girls. But it's kind of like you're working in two different gears. Like you have these main roster girls who they're not bad. There's really good talent, but it's like they're so used to working the way they're designed that it's like they work with these NXT women. And it's like they're trying to be brought to a different level, and they're kind of I think they just kind of clash in that sense. Like you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
there's two different mindsets there, and it's like it's a big mess. It's like
And
no one
another thing too is like they just throw them out and they're thinking that like giving them 15 minutes is
exactly.
gonna like fix everything. No, NXT doesn't even do that. Like the takeover specials, like those are usually like 15, 20 minutes. And every once in a while they'll have like these really longer matches on TV, but it's always for a reason. There's always a story behind it. You can't just put these long matches together and just expect them to be great every week. You need to do more than that.
Those should honestly just be pay-per-view matches where you throw them out there for like 15 minutes on the right spot in a pay-per-view and let them get over. Where it's like in the meantime, like you said, you build to the matches on TV. That's the way it should be. But it's the problem with a lot of WWE right now, where it's like they just throw these long matches out there and they don't really build the stories to make you think like, oh, I want to see this at the pay-per-view. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
they don't know the formula. They just kind of think, oh, well, we have a 3-hour show, so just give them 15 minutes out there. Let
Yeah,
them
because
do their
this
thing.
it's not just a women issue either. I mean,
No, it's
mid
the whole
carders,
yeah.
tag teams, they don't really get how to get anybody over anymore, and it's sad. The only people that really get stories are the main eventers, and even those stories really aren't great. It's just the same stuff we've been seeing since 1998, like the faces versus the authority figures, and like their chosen champion. That's like the only story we seem to get anymore.
And the whole thing is like they talk about this whole women's revolution and changing the world because the world's changing. That stuff didn't happen because they were like, oh, well, this is the women's revolution. Watch. That stuff happened just because they put it together and it organically happened.
Exactly.
Ronda Rousey just like obviously you can't really, I guess you could sway matches, put her in like favorable matches you could win, but other than that, it's like she just dominates on her own and looks that way and comes off that way and presents herself that way. And even like the women's soccer team they mentioned, like that just came out of nowhere. Like those girls just won the gold cup and it was like this big moment. It just kind of grew on its own. But you can't force that. You can't be like, oh hey, this is happening. You can only like kind of get in people's minds like, oh, this is pretty cool. Like let me see this. But it's
Dude,
like, Go ahead.
I'm not an MMA fan, but if they had like, if like during every one of Ronda Rousey's matches, like the announcers are like, it's a women's revolution in
Exactly.
MMA,
It
I
would
think
get
that would
annoying.
do more harm than good.
Exactly. It
I
would be
think this is
forced.
turning people off.
Exactly. It would be forced and, create unrealistic expectations where it's like, it's like you just got to let it organically happen. And, you got to, you know, introduce these women and give them characters. You can't just say like, oh, well, this is a revolution. Having these great matches in NXT. You care about them. It's like, you got to give them a reason to care about them. And you got to give them the reason you want to see them fight. You know what I mean? It's just like, it's so simple. We both know it, but they apparently don't know it.
All right, we got one more thing to talk about here. We got to touch on Lucha Underground because this is a Lucha Underground podcast. I was very happy with the way that they used women in Lucha Underground. I would have liked to see more women, and I actually would have liked to see a women's division. I'm kind of hoping that when season 2 comes, we'll kind of maybe see that. But they really pushed these women in a strong way. Like Eva and Sexy Star were presented in a way where they were like equal to the guys. And like Black Lotus, she always had a story going on. Everybody always had a story going on. And it was just a really great use of the women. Like Katrina, she was more of like a valet than like a wrestler, but she was like this powerful character where it's
Exactly.
like
She brought back Mil Muertes from the dead. She connived that whole plan. So
exactly. Like you could argue that like everything going on with Mil Muertes, like she's the one in charge, and it's I was very happy with the way that Lucha Underground used women.
yeah, definitely. I mean, I know some people had their issues with the intergender stuff, and it could be a little out there, but they always presented them in a strong way. And even like Eva Lise, they kind of worked off that injury and had her look like this tough girl. And it's like, they knew what they were doing. They knew how to present them. They didn't force it down your throat. They were like, oh, this is the way women should be or whatever. They just let it
Okay, to
happen.
be fair, Matt Striker did do that every
That's true.
once in a while.
He did do that. I can't say he didn't do that, but it wasn't like every show where he'd like beat you over the head with it,
Yeah,
like to the point where like the
it's
announcers
not
doing it
nearly as
wrong.
bad as you see on
Exactly.
WWE.
It's just like getting it out there and trying to brand it. But, it's just like one of those things where it's like, I just think it worked because, they kept it simple. They just knew what they were doing. They knew how to present these women in different ways. They weren't just the same women doing different things. They were, different women. They all had something unique to them. Like Sexy Star had the mask and had this lucha style, whereas Eva Lise was more the tough girl that would just like be ready to fight men. And, you had like Black Lotus, like you said, being kind of like this unique, Kill Bill style like character where she was just like this unique person who could just do all these weird like crazy things. And Katrina, who's like this more darker character that kind of like the whole evil conniving thing we mentioned earlier was just like that. It's like you had all these different women who bring something different to the table, and that's really what you just need in those divisions is just all women with different characters who bring something to the table that's different.
When you think about the future of women's wrestling, do you think it's bright, or do you think they're just going to screw it up again, and we're just going to have to wait again for another kind of thing to pop up in a few years, where it's like we're going to give it another chance and hope they don't screw it up?
Right now, I'm kind of like in that boat where I think we're gonna have to wait a few years, but it could change. I don't want to say it couldn't. I just feel like they're kind of like in this weird state where they're like these women are gonna kind of get over because they're talented, but it's like I don't know if it's gonna be to the point where they want it to be. I don't know if it's the point where we want it to be. I think it's gonna be just they don't really know what they're doing unless something drastic happens and they have this like change of attitude. I think it's just going to be like one of those things where it's like we look at it and it's like, oh hey, you remember that period? Like we had some like maybe a good match or two, but it's like until they actually give them the time to build feuds, like actual feuds that get segments
Yeah.
on the show. I don't think it's going to change too much, and it's kind of sad to say that, but. Even in NXT, I'm kind of just like look at the next crop of girls, and it's like they have the talent down there, but it's like can they establish them? Can they make them work?
They did just sign Kana, so that's a big
I didn't hear
improvement.
about that. They did. That's
Yep.
awesome. I was kind of wondering that because they showed her like on the Takeover show, and it was kind of like mentioning her. Was, even though they misspelled her name, it was kind of unique to see that.
Yeah.
Like when did they ever do that? But that definitely helps. Is she going to be like wrestling or training? Because I know they kind of have like some trainers down
I
there.
believe she's going to be wrestling, so it could be her and Bailey on the next special for all we know. They
See, there is
have
promise there.
Jesse
Yep.
McKay hasn't even debuted yet. She's really good. Casey
Well, she's
Cassie's really
technically
good.
debuted, but just not like as her
Well,
character.
kind of,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
But I think the future in NXT is bright. WWE, I mean, we'll see. I do think it's going to be better. I think at worst, we're probably going to go back to like that like late 2000s kind of period where like we had like Mickey James and Beth Phoenix, where it's like you get some good matches and maybe a little more character work, especially when they end the stable stuff. I think it's going to get better. But I don't really think we're going to get quite what we want it to be yet.
I'll tell you.
And
Go ahead.
we're just going to kind of take what we can get.
I'll tell you this. I think the real measure of this whole thing is, like you said, not when the stables end, I think when Nikki loses the title to whoever she loses to, whether it's
Yeah,
Sasha, Becky, or I think that's going to be the measuring point because I think even for the Bellas, that's going to be a measuring point, to kind of, give them a different position on the card. I think people will be more accepting to that. And I think in general, it's going to be interesting to see how they book these champions. They kind of like put it over. So it's kind of interesting to see if they kind of have them face each other and kind of have these feuds, or if they kind of just do what they always do and kind of like focus on one and maybe do like a little feud and then that's it. It's like I'm in there. I
yeah.
think that's a true measuring point. I think right now it's kind of like that weird period where you're kind of like, I don't have high hopes for it, but I'm not counting
I
it
don't
out.
either.
But you're not counting it out, so it's like it's not dead yet. There's a chance. It's like it depends on how they do things after this whole period. This whole stable thing plays out.
That's kind of my prediction. Is I think it's going to get better, and I think they're going to get more focused when they end the stable stuff. But I'm
Yeah,
just
it's
not
not
sure we're
there
going to
yet.
get like the NXT stuff. But who knows? So many things can change in wrestling. But this was fun.
It definitely was. I had a fun time talking about this, and even revisiting it someday would be fun. Like down the line when this whole thing plays out, to kind of like retouch on our thoughts on that.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week. What should we go over next week?
That's a good question.
We should put some thought into that this week, but
Yeah.
we'll have some kind of topic next week. But yeah, I want to thank everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week, everybody. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't you dare miss it.